Hi, Loveland. This is Mrs. Streff. We're reading about hobby horses and bicycles today. I'm starting on page 45. This is actually the hobby horse at my house. My husband's father made it for my children when they were little. Hobby horses. In the 15th century, an unknown German artist did a very unusual painting. The work, St. Dorothy and the Christ Child, shows Jesus as a child happily riding a hobby horse. Though the painting was beautifully rendered, Christian clergymen criticized both the painting and the artist. They called the artist a sinner and a fool. Jesus could not have ridden a hobby horse since it had not yet been invented when he was a boy. The artist apologized for creating the painting. He told the clergymen that they were right about the toy not existing then and that it was careless of him to have painted such a picture. As punishment, the clergyman ordered the artist never to paint again. Almost 400 years passed. In the 19th century, archaeologists on a dig in the Middle East discovered many hobby horses, most of which were between 1,000 and 3,000 years old. Incredibly, hobby horses had been around during the time that Jesus had lived, and they definitely were one of the toys he might have played with as a child. The painter never knew he had been right. He ended his career believing his painting was both sinful and inaccurate. The hobby horse was invented in the Middle East, in and around where Christ grew up. It was also invented in China, Europe, and Africa. Like so many inventions, this toy sprang up in many parts of the world. There are three kinds of hobby horses: the stick variety, the rocking horse, and the wheeled hobby horse. The sticker broom handle horse has remained popular for centuries. Some of the early versions were rather crudely made, but they served their purpose. As an old English nursery rhyme put it, I had a little hobby horse, and it was dapple gray. Its head was made of pea straw, its tail was made of hay. During the Middle Ages, such stick horses were sold at summer fairs in Europe, and every toy seller carried them on his pack. They came in various sizes, and sometimes the sticks were long enough for several children to ride at the same time. The rocking horse evolved from the rocking baby cradle, which later was the inspiration for the rocking chair. As tin and iron became popular in toy making in the 19th century, all sorts of new rocking toys were invented. Toy makers introduced mechanical horses, coaches, buggies, fire engines, and every kind of vehicle a horse could pull. Other animals also entered the picture: rocking lions, zebras, elephants, and tigers. Such toys are still popular today. Hobby horses on wheels are the most recent variation. However, they are not as new as was previously believed. It was once thought that the first wheeled hobby horse was made in England during the 17th century. It was later discovered that children were riding on them in China at least 300 years earlier. The proof is a huge silk wall hanging woven in 14th century China that shows children riding on hobby horses with wooden wheels. Hobby horse history is fun and filled with surprises. As for the future, we can only wonder what it holds for this toy that has been part of our lives for so long. Will they be solar powered or train-like and run on tracks? Or will there be robotic hobby horses? No one knows. All we can be sure of is that they will be around for a very long time. Here are some fun facts. Nabrahma, an African king in the 19th century, always rode on a wheeled hobby horse pushed by slaves. In the epic poem The Iliad, the Greeks built what might be considered the largest, most unusual, and most clever hobby horse of all time, the Trojan horse. During the Middle Ages, actors and dancers sometimes had hobby horses attached to their costumes in such a way that it appeared that they were riding them. The hobby horses were either sewn to the costume or slung from a belt. In Europe, during the Middle Ages, a hobby was a high-spirited, medium-sized breed of horse. Let's go on to learn about bicycles. We are on page 50. In the world of inventions, In the world of inventions, the bicycle followed right after the wheeled hobby horse. All in all, the bicycle actually evolved from the kiddie car. It had four wheels that could be moved only by pushing with the feet against the ground. Often, the kiddie cars were made to resemble animals. More speed. Children wanted their kiddie cars to go faster. First, the animal design was done away with. Then off went a couple of the wheels. The two remaining wheels were greatly enlarged and then aligned down the center of the vehicle. Finally, handlebars and footrests were added. These primitive two-wheelers went much faster than the four-wheeled kiddie cars. They were a huge improvement, but they had a long way to go before becoming true bicycles. Pushing with one's feet against the ground was still the only way to make them move. Worse, there was no way to steer or stop them. In 1816, Frenchman Jean Nepis invented the first bicycle that could be steered. Called the celeripede, the contraption, including the wheels, was made entirely of wood. In 1839, a Scottish blacksmith by the name of Kirkpatrick Macmillan came up with the idea of putting pedals on bicycles. The pedals were connected by long rods to the rear wheel, and the rear wheel was made to turn by pushing back and forth on the pedals. Though Macmillan's bicycle was constructed mostly of wood, the rods and the pedals were iron, and the wooden wheels had iron tires. How much did Macmillan know about the history of the bicycle? Chances are he was well aware that it had evolved from the hobby horse. A finishing touch he had put on the front of his bicycle was a carved wood horse's head. It was a teenage boy and his father who invented pedals that work like those we use today. Pedals that go around in a continuous motion instead of being pushed back and forth. The way they came up with the idea is fascinating. It's one of those cases in which the basic idea was one invention. It was one of those cases in which the basic idea behind one invention led to the idea for another. Here's what happened. One afternoon in March 1861, Ernest Michaud and his father Pierre set out to make footrests for a bicycle. His gaze coming to rest on a grindstone in the shed, young Ernest suddenly exclaimed that he had an idea. They could put pedals on the bicycle that, like the pedals on the grindstone, could be kept turning in a non-stop motion. For several days, the two worked side by side. When the bicycle was finished, Ernest took the first ride. Later he wrote, "I was elated. The drive wheel revolved as though turning the handle and crank of a grindstone. The bicycle worked beautifully." Before the year was out, the Michaud were manufacturing and selling the new bicycles. They were called velocipedes. The name is French and means speedy fast. A man named James Starley invented spoked wheels and tubular steel frames. He also invented the world's goofiest looking bicycle, the kind with the huge front wheel and a tiny rear wheel. Called the ordinary, for no known reason, it had both its good and bad points. The ordinary gave a much faster ride than any bicycle before it. Its speed was partly due to its hollow, light frame, but even more so because of its giant front drive wheel. Bicycles at this time had no gears. The speed at which they moved depended entirely on the drive wheel. The larger the wheel, the faster the bike. The ordinary was not only fast, it gave a smooth ride. Enthusiasts liked it for the same reason that most people hated it. Riding an ordinary was dangerous, tricky, and required great skill. Because of its height, it was difficult just to mount the bike, and because of the size of its drive wheel, it was also hard to get the vehicle going. It was tricky to steer too, and it tipped over easily, especially when turning. Worst of all, any attempt at braking, particularly when headed downhill, often sent the rider flying over the handlebars. Most people could not ride an ordinary. It was not fear of falling and getting hurt. The reason was a different problem altogether, and a pretty insurmountable one. Only long-legged people could ride these bicycles. Individuals of average build, or less than average, could not reach the pedals. Thus, during this era, most people had to ride tricycles. 1874, that was the year that H.J. Lawson designed what he called the safety bicycle. Chain-driven and made with wheels of equal size, the safety was the forerunner of the modern bicycle. 14 years later, John Dunlop made the safety a softer ride. He came up with the idea of pneumatic or air-filled tires. Until this time, they had either been solid rubber or semi-hollow cushion tires. In addition to inventing the ordinary, James Starley was determined to make a bicycle for women that was proper. That is, one designed so a woman could ride in formal attire without straddling the seat. What he came up with was definitely the craziest, most dangerous bicycle ever invented. Imagine trying to ride a bike side saddle. Starley designed and built a bike that women rode while sitting on a 45-degree angle to the front. The contraption had a box-like sideways seat and was fitted with a complex pedal and crank mechanism. Naturally, it was almost impossible to steer and balance, and almost every woman who tried riding it got hurt. To this day, we still see carryover of this special bikes for females. Take, for example, the down-curved loop frame on women's bicycles. Back in the 19th century, manufacturers made them this way to give clearance for ladies' frocks and dresses, but that was a long time ago. Unfortunately, things have changed, and female cyclists now have to wear pants and shorts. Here are some fun facts. Macmillan was not only the first to put pedals on the bicycle, he also committed the first ever biking offense. On June 10, 1842, after a 40-mile ride, he accidentally crashed into a child and was fined 5 shillings. Scotsman John Dunlop developed the idea for the pneumatic tire to help his son ride a tricycle to school over rough cobblestones. The highest speed ever achieved on a bicycle was set by Dr. A. Abbott of California in 1980. Pedaling behind a giant windshield mounted on a speeding car, Dr. Abbott reached a speed of 140 miles per hour. In Japan, there are contests to see who can go the slowest on a bicycle. The record was set in 1965 by T. Matsaushi of Tokyo, who rode his bicycle for 5 hours and 25 minutes without going anywhere. In the 19th century, a new type of bicycle became common, the tandem, which 2 people could ride at the same time. Tandem tricycles also came into vogue during this era, especially in England. In 1987, 2 men rode their bikes to the top of the Himalayas, Mount Kalalapatar, a peak of more than 18,000 feet. Quite a few people have accomplished the feat of riding a bicycle across the United States. One was Becky Gorton. Becky was only 11 years old when she arrived in Boston, Massachusetts on July 22, 1973, having set out from Olympia, Washington on June 6th of that year.